when you kill a man from the next village over, you may have grown up and lived with that person all of your life, but at some point the fissioning process and the internal struggles get so bad that the two villages fission, and then at that point it begins to fit more comfortably a Clausewitzian model. So the answer to your first part is your question is much more technical and complex than what it appears, and a lot of the victims of these people are in fact people that they knew personally, and in some cases were related to them. But in general, they tend not to kill their most immediate close relatives. The second aspect of your question, during the first 6 years of my professional career after I got my PhD, I was a member of the University of Michigan's Department of Human Genetics, and we did very extensive, elaborate biomedical research programs among the Yanomamo, which involved ultimately the collection of several thousand samples of blood from as many different individuals. At one point, we did check for possible paternity exclusion, where we had both the putative father, the mother, and the offspring. And on the basis of the blood serum tests that we made, we were able to exclude something like 5% of the children on those several different blood group systems, and for sake of, adding other possible errors, such as differences in laboratory analyses of the same blood samples, we added another 5% as kind of a fudge factor, and the figure was published that perhaps as many as 10% of Yanomamo children could not have been the father, or the children of the man who they told me was the father. But in some of those cases, in fact, a fairly large fraction of them, the Yanomamo themselves weren't sure which of 2 or 3 different guys was the father. So, they do have a fairly keen awareness and are concerned about paternity, and to the extent that they're willing to report what they know to me, they tend to be quite accurate. Let me also point out something that may not be widely known among people in our own society. The same research department at the University of Michigan Hospital or Medical School did a study in a fairly large town in southern Michigan, and in first children of marriages, the exclusion was higher than 10%.
Okay, in all these quotes we had on good and evil, my twin brother Tony just telepathically sent me this one, which didn't appear, which is, it isn't good, it isn't bad, it's just business. So my question to Dr. Siegel is, to what extent are our views of morality something that differs genetically? Is there a heritability to ethical judgment?
Well, there have been a number of twin studies done, primarily studies in Australia at the Queensland Institute in Brisbane that did a study on social attitudes. And I suspect, if I remember correctly, there were a couple of questions thrown in about morality, but obviously we analyzed the data according to scales, not items. And there was evidence of a heritable component to social attitudes. Now, this is not to suggest that there is a gene for how you're going to believe, but rather one might think that the underlying component to this genetic finding is some personality characteristic or some intellectual style, something of that sort. Tom Bouchard also published a study recently on religious attitudes, and again, it's not a gene for whether you're a Catholic or a Jew or whatever, but degree of religious commitment or religious interest. And again, there was a substantial heritable component, 40 to 50%. So I think this is going to cause us to rethink a lot of the data in this area.
This is one of those questions for the panel. Speculate, if you would, what is the most important unanswered question in evolutionary psychology right now, the answering of which would make the most difference or be most exciting to you?
Why? No, that's the question.
A little more specific.
You got the microphone.
He's not letting me pass, he's stepping on the wire.
Ambivalent.
Got any takers on that one?
I'll give it a shot. One way to answer that question is just to read what the other people have done. Napoleon mentioned Richard Alexander's book. There's a lot of books. The best one I came across was Issues in Evolutionary Ethics, that is a collection of the best essays by all the thinkers, pro, con, and middle, on the subject: Darwin, Huxley, Spencer, Wilson, Michael Ruse, and Kitcher, and so on. And unfortunately, it's from the State University of New York Press, which means it's obscure and expensive. But if you want to write that down, you can probably order it through a bookstore. It's a handy way to get your mind around all of it and just read what these guys say. For me, I'd really like to know, oh, sorry, the editor is Paul Thompson, Issues in Evolutionary Ethics. It's a SUNY, State University of New York Press, SUNY Press. It's a handy guide to get your mind around it. And I'd like to know, I'm really curious about this ancestral environment. It's such a new concept of the psychology of it. I think that's the great unanswered one yet. I think that's where that's where the action is. And I will say this, that I read a lot of books on ethics, just general, by philosophers with no biological training. And these were the single boringest things I've ever read. It was so boring reading these ethical books. But the most interesting stuff was the ethics stuff written by biologists. I felt like they had something to say that you can really sink your teeth into. It wasn't, you know, A prime does B prime and so on. It was actually, you know, talking about animals and what they do and humans and what they do. That's my answer.
Any other comment?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but is it what's most interesting to me, what I think is most pressing in evolutionary psychology?
The major unanswered question, I believe, that you would most want to see answered.
The thing I perhaps define the field somewhat more narrowly, but the thing that I would like to see more attention paid to are the mechanisms of self-deceit, which falls squarely into the arena of evolutionary psychology. I think that humans probably have a unique ability in this regard. I think they have an ability to have a whole knowledge base which they are not in command of, which tells them what reality is, that the knowledge base that they have that they are in command of is the one that they fabricate to be most functional with, which is not a picture of reality. And if we could find out how those two go together, how the one that tracks reality and the one that tracks presentation of self in everyday life could be figured out, we would figure out most of the lies that we tell ourselves, and so all of the lies that we tell each other. So I think that would be a gold mine.
Whoops. Next question here.
I'd like to ask both of this. Oh, sorry.
There was a couple of comments.
Go ahead. Go.
All right, just to add one thought. I mean, there's a number of things. That was a great answer from John, I think. The evolutionary psychology, as soon as you start thinking in that way, as soon as you have a loyalty to that method, to borrow a phrase from Ernest Gellner, your mind just absolutely starts racing with all sorts of possible solutions to all sorts of possible problems. And I wouldn't want to select out one. I mean, you know, why are humans aggressive and so on. What is interesting to me personally, which I think is will be very rewarding, it's not the most important, but will be rewarding, is to pick up the idea of the expanding circle, Peter Singer's idea. If you move backwards and say, one of the key things here is what does it mean to have a self-concept, not a self-percept, not the capacity to simply be aware of your envelope, but to have your sense of yourself as an objective agent. And when does that happen, and what's the ontogeny of that? I'm very interested in that. You probably know that some of the work that's been done has involved what Gordon Gallup called a mirror self-recognition test. Are you aware of this? You surreptitiously put a little red dot on the head of say, a gorilla and present it to a mirror that it's familiar with the conventions of mirrors but has never really looked in one before. And different species have a different response to their own image in a mirror. Chimps will try and figure out what it is that's on their forehead. A child below about 18 months will go and look behind the mirror and see who's looking at it. And after that age, will realize that it's itself. It has a self-concept. Most monkeys, for example, just get enraged and try and attack this image in the mirror. So it looked as though there was a sort of a phylogenetic cutoff point, but just recently, two or 3 weeks ago, Mark Hauser at Harvard took some little creatures called cotton-top tamarins. Do you know what they look like? Very pretty little things with this great white tuft up here, and he turned them into punk tamarins. He used vegetable dyes and made the white tuft green and pink and orange and all sorts of different covers, and put them in front of the mirror, and they all essentially went, "Whoa! What's happened to my hair?"